is correct, as Theodor Dieter has claimed, namely that Luther has a preference for Plato. To make the strangeness of Luther's use of these Aristotelian concepts even more puzzling, consider the effect materia and forma had for the understanding of how justification came about. Although central figures such as Thomas Aquinas underline the immanence of the soul in the body, he nevertheless gave the soul an immortality apart from the body, as we have seen. When the nominalist theologians utilized Thomas' categorical notion of the soul as superior to the body in their understanding of mercy, grace, namely its tendency to participate in the divine life of immortality, it could be a source in framing the moral life according to God's will. Because in his absolute power, God had freely ordained a covenant with the human beings to do what is in them, facere quod in se est. Luther countered this in his thesis 27 and saw it as a problematic use of ratio in the sphere of soteriology, of salvation. Already in his disputation against scholastic theology, Luther did mention the problematic connection of Aristotelian categories and theology proper. Here it is said at the outset that man has become a bad tree. Luther claims that the ethics of Aristotle seems to diffuse that insight, namely that neither do the natural powers control our actions, thesis 39, nor is Aristotle's idea of an inherent inclination to happiness possible to conform with grace. He sees the systems as incompatible. This distinction between body and soul was also crucial. The distinction between body and soul was crucial to Renaissance philosophy and their optimistic anthropology. As had the ancient Neoplatonists of antiquity, Renaissance authors emphasized that man was the ontological link between the material world and the intelligible world, as vinculum mundi. On the one hand, man's immortal soul united man with God, with the immaterial and eternal world up there, and was as such his greatest source of dignity. On the other hand, man was tied to the world of things through his body. Pico della Mirandola went even one step further and claimed in his famous oration on the dignity of man from 1486 that God gives Adam a fundamental ontological flexibility. Man himself could choose the level of existence within reality. Man could rise to the God or fall to the animals. The strange thing was that the ideal development could move in both directions simultaneously. Man's humanity grew through being exposed to the letters and ideals of antiquity, and by becoming more human, he developed his divinity too. An important condition for the anthropology of the Renaissance authors was exactly its moral, immortal, spiritual nature, and the possibility to distinguish that immortal nature from the body. Let us now move to possible solutions to our puzzle. In his large commentary on Luther's disputation concerning man, the De Homine, Gerhard Ebeling underlined a central problem, namely how the individual soul entered man. Traditionally, there have been two solutions in the Christian tradition, the creationist and the traducianist solution. The most common of them, the creationist account, comes very close to the Platonic understanding of an eternal soul. By a separate act of procreation, God, so to speak, implants or infuses the soul into the bodily framework, and by that token, the soul is not essentially connected to the body. In the traducian solution, on the other hand, both the body and the soul are received from the parents. The Latin noun tradux denotes a vine trained for propagation, and thereby suggested that something was rather cultivated by human beings than divinely made. But as Ebeling underlines, Luther is careful not to claim that a specific answer has to be given to this question, because there are no clear answers to be drawn from Scripture. The question is, in other words, open to consideration from experience and reason. However, there is no doubt that Luther prefers the traducianist account. Ebeling claims that this is easier to combine with the idea of original sin. If the individual soul had been created by God separately, outside the normal order of creation, this could be regarded as a clean spot, as a thing in man untouched by sin. More importantly, in my opinion, is Luther's anthropological notion of man as a whole. He is deeply skeptical to all attempts of dissolving man into different parts, at least after the bitter debates with the spiritualists and at last Zwingli, who characterized Luther as a Fleischfresser, a meat eater. Now, although there are differences between Luther's understanding of the sacrament and the sacramental presence and his anthropology, there are some structural similarities. In his commentary on John, the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verse 14, namely the Word became flesh, for example, Luther underlined the similarity between Scripture's use of the word flesh and the German word Leib. That is, they both denote a person consisting of both body and soul. So flesh, sarx in the Greek language, and Leib, Leiblichkeit in the German language, they both denotes body and soul. Luther's position is not only different, a different accentuation of the relation between body and soul than the Renaissance philosopher, but his position is at odds with that of Thomas Aquinas too. Although Thomas closely followed Aristotle, he nevertheless insisted that the human soul as such is incorruptible and eternal, and that the anima separata, the soul that is distinguished from the body, would continue to live after death, as has been commented upon. This doctrine of a soul that continues to live on is fundamental to the Christian tradition in the West. The idea that soul and body separates at the time of death is particularly important for Augustine, and it is an idea we can find in the young Luther too. In his commentary on St. Paul's letter to the Romans, which we heard yesterday, he says, "Natural or temporal death is the separation of the body and the soul." Now, for the late Luther, it is of vital importance to remind his listeners and readers that body and soul belong together. In fact, he never seems to grow tired of this theme. However, it is in Luther's reflection on the Christian hope we can see the most fundamental affirmation of this, his insistence on the unity of the anthropological components, I would argue, and this is the core of my talk today. In the disputation concerning man, in the De Homine, it is found already in thesis 3, and I suppose you have the thesis as a separate handout, where the philosophical definition is strictly confined as a definition within the limits of philosophy. Luther confined this philosophy as within this life of mortality. The lack of philosophy's eternal potential demands a careful examination of the border between philosophy and theology. We could perhaps say that death marks an epistemological border. That is, philosophy reaches towards death, but not further. Luther's praise of the intellectual ability and scientific endeavor in the following thesis must be seen in light of that confinement. The blunt embrace of the powers of reason may come as a surprise, as Luther is first and foremost known for his doctrine of sin. We should note that the belief in reason here is projected to the real world, not just to the integral state in the Garden of Eden. It's just some paradise talk. God endowed man with reason when he created Adam, yet he also confirms the majesty of the ratio after sin entered the world, as Luther claims in Thesis 9. Still, it is the ratio of the world, which for Luther means that reality is only known in retrospect, a posteriore, as it were. Now this is 200 years before Immanuel Kant. This philosophical knowledge cannot be known by other means than by observation, which is a weaker form of knowledge than necessary truths within the Aristotelian concept of science. It means that the relation between the body and the soul is only being observed as an exemplar, perhaps we could say. Theology, in contrast, can know man from God's initial word of address in his Anrede, as we heard from Oswald Bayer in the last talk. This is a knowledge a priori. It comes before the things, so to speak, before observation. Therefore, in theological use, the image of God is not only discovered by reflecting on the actual activity of man, but theology claims to know how human beings can hear their true nature from the source of their existence. This statement does not try to solve the riddle of the soul, but the doctrine of creation, fall, and redemption gives some clues, as we will see. The contrast between philosophical and theological knowledge is explicated by Luther by using Aristotle's theory of the four causes. Now, Aristotle used it to explain different aspects of his theological model, namely that a thing evolves into what it is. Because an important part of scientific knowledge about nature is investigation into the causes of why things come into existence and why they perish. Aristotle explained his model both in his metaphysics and in his physics. In the metaphysics, he used the famous illustration of the bronze statue. The statue has a material cause, namely the bronze itself. It has a formal cause, something that is its essence. In his physics, Aristotle mentions that the form of the musical octave is 2:1 to explain it. Now, the artist, third, is the statue's efficient cause. And finally, there is the final cause, namely the purpose of the statue. Perhaps to be beautiful or to be an object of admonition and so forth. In the physics, Aristotle gives the example of health as the final cause of walking about. Why do we walk? Well, we want to be healthy. It is the aim, the overall purpose of a movement. Now, Luther uses these four causes to explain the nature of man. And he asks, what can philosophy know about man? Philosophy can hardly know sufficiently about man's material cause, namely the body. It can know something, but not much. The philosophers will never agree on man's formal cause, namely man's soul, according to Luther. Still, the knowledge of the body and the soul is not rejected altogether. However, the efficient and final causes represent a straightforward ignorance for theology. The efficient cause, the artist of man, is God, and the final cause, the purpose of living, is not health or happiness, it is life with God. This is only possible to know for theology. The final course of philosophy does only know the peace of this life, Luther says in Thesis 14. The problem, as Luther sees it, is that the definition is not trustworthy due to the uncertainty of this life. This life is fragmentary. It is fleeting and exceedingly material, he says in Thesis 19. Hence, philosophy has a very thin and shallow understanding of the causes. Luther made a sweeping commentary to philosophy's lack of understanding of the causes in his 1532 commentary of Psalm 127. Except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain, they that built it. And Luther's comment on it is, Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero think that the final cause is honor and glory. The efficient course is the prudent and good man, and the formal course concerns the primary functions of the state, such as the ability to distinguish between justice and injustice. But the whole project is problematic because the final course is not known by these ancient philosophers and rhetoricians. Now let us jump to the second part of the thesis, namely the theological thesis from 20 to 40. They are all centered around thesis 32, where man is simply defined as justified by faith. Hominem justificari fide. This main content is first told as the Christian story of creation, fall, and redemption. Luther frames this theological insight critically. Man is under the power of sin, death, and devil, which in turn restrains the power of philosophy. When Luther, however, adapts the four courses for a single definition of hope, he uses Aristotle's concepts and fills them with biblical content. Man is the simple material of God for the form of his future life. Here we can observe a range of similarities and differences compared